So since I had COVID this past week, I've been thinking about this a fair bit, but I had actually meant to bring it up the previous week had I been here. But do you realize that we're more or less in the third anniversary? That the the experience of COVID breaking out in 2020 was a little bit earlier in the month of March. I remember that clear as day. Sharon and I coming back from travel, and then we were concerned we would have to isolate because of the travel. But then it turns out we were all isolating, and so we were going to stop the spread by you know, isolating for 2 weeks, and that didn't go so well. That kept on, you know. So anyway, for 3 years now, we've been in this different environment, and so I don't know what your feelings are, recollections are of how this is the well, especially that first year, but even since then, we're still dealing with it in certain ways. But how that's been for you, what that's been like for you. Um, I, as I think about it, the thing that has been sort of surprising and dismaying about the whole COVID experience has been that a lot of times we would think that as a nation, as a society, as a world, that when there are the crisis that comes, that crisis would bring us together, right? And that we would kind of come together to fight whatever this is. And the the crazy thing about the experience of COVID was it did just the opposite. Um, so people have talked about how crisis forges our character, but it also reveals our character. And as I think about what it's meant in our society, I mean, if you think of practically any and every institution in our society, the level of trust is eroded in terms of how we feel like, or certain people feel like they handled this crisis. And in the midst of the crisis, there was the experience that we have of this overabundance of information, kind of this new world we're living in where we're bombarded by all kinds of information sources that are all competing for our attention, and then of course with algorithms that reinforce messages that get more traction, and the messages that get more traction, as we know, are the messages of fear and outrage. And so in this crazy world, that experience, or that sense of those people don't know what they're doing, and it's making me so mad and making me so afraid, that experience was amplified in all kinds of degrees. And so again, we emerge out of that experience of COVID with much less uh, joy and confidence and sense of community with our nation, with even our community, and sometimes even within our churches. We think of individuals. I think in some ways there are people that we would look to as heroes in this. I think especially of some of the people who are healthcare professionals, just working like crazy to help people. But for the most part, as we think about uh, kind of people and leaders, again, the feeling that a lot of us have is how this person let us down and that thing was a failure. And so there's a lot of ways in which this experience of COVID leaves us, these last 3 years leaves us in a worse place. Um, Someone said this, that adversity is like a strong wind. It tears away from us all but the things that cannot be torn, and so we see ourselves as we really are. And as much as we'd like to focus the negativity that we might have been experiencing, as much as we'd like to focus that on those other people and how they let us down and how they were wrong and how they overreacted or whatever the mess, whatever our sense is about them. But part of us, we have to look in the mirror and think about how we overreacted or how we got super frustrated or how we got so overwhelmed by our anxiety and fear. Um, Martin Luther King Jr. said about crisis, he said, the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands in times of challenge and controversy. And so once again, this idea is that uh, our character gets built and gets forged in the context of crisis and struggle, but it also gets revealed when the going gets tough, when things are against us. Now, I bring all that up because first off, I just wanted to acknowledge this reality, and my belief and my hope for us as a church, and for in our community, and as we extend our message to our broader community, is that we can be a place of healing and restoration in the midst of the brokenness, the added levels of brokenness that have come into our world through these last 3 years. But I also bring it up because this gets us to the discussion or the context of the passage we're looking at, which is John chapter 11, which is Jesus really at the height of challenge and controversy and fear in his ministry. Give me just a second. I'm going to drink. So, I said a couple weeks ago that this section of the Gospel of John describes the opposition, the growing opposition that Jesus is experiencing. And so, in the midst of this, well, I'll say a little bit more about why this is the case, but he's gone away from Jerusalem, across the Jordan River, to the place where John had been baptizing. And then he hears this news. He hears the news about Lazarus, his friend, who is very sick. So let's go ahead and look at these first few verses of John chapter 11. Again, if you have a Bible there in front of you, look with me. It says, now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. By the way, Bethany is a very short distance away from Jerusalem. Okay, so and Jerusalem, of course, is we're talking about danger zone for Jesus. Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. When he heard this, Jesus said, this sickness will not end in death. No, it's for the Lord's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha and her sister Lazarus, yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Then he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. But Rabbi, they said, a short while ago the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you're going back there? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? A man who walks by day will not stumble, for he sees by his world's light. It is when he walks by night that he stumbles, for he has no light. After he said this, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he'll get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad I was not there, so that you might believe. But let us go to him. Then Thomas, who's called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Okay, let's stop there. So the first thing that this passage reveals to us or reminds us of is that Jesus was motivated by courage and love. Jesus was a very courageous person. He, uh, well, I'm going to just mention it to you right now. There were multiple times. I don't know if you know this, but there are 8 times in the Gospels that we are told that people were trying to kill Jesus, and there just had been 2 different times. This is probably, again, this is near the end of Jesus' ministry, but there were 2 different times. First in John chapter 8, when he claims, uses the name I am to refer to him. It says at that point the Jews tried to stone him. Then a little bit later, Jesus has another conversation with them, and they try to stone him again, and he gets away. And then he goes to the other side of the Jordan. And so when he says, let's go back to Bethany now and connect with this family, with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, the disciples are freaking out. They're like, don't go back there. And it's Thomas, who we know of as doubting Thomas. His thing comes up later in the gospel. But here's a fun fact. I'm just going to give you this fun fact. If you ever have a Bible trivia thing and this comes up, now you'll know. Thomas was not his name. In fact, we don't even know what his name is. Do you realize that? Thomas is actually Aramaic, the word for twin. And then it says here he's also called Didymus, which is a Greek word for twin. So his Aramaic thing to describe him meant the twin, and this thing is Didymus also is the twin. So whatever his name, let's call him Dave. So doubting Dave, how about that? So he speaks up for the disciples and says, okay, and this is a big statement of faith on his part. Okay, we're going to die. Let's go with him. And so they make this trek back in the belief that these threats that have happened, people trying to kill Jesus, that it's going to happen again. But Jesus went into that because he wanted to help. So then, I'll just say this quick. Here's a way to think about Jesus' ministry. I think I might have shared this before, but I'm going to share it again here. This can help you think about how the story of Jesus and the narratives of the Gospels, how they all fit together. And you can think about Jesus' ministry really falling into 3 year-long phases. And the first year of his ministry, growth and excitement, and the crowds are swarming, and he's doing these miracles, and it's all amazing. And then in the second year, that is begun by Jesus switching his focus from gathering big crowds, and that's where he selects the 12. And then much of his focus in that second year is on training the 12. And then he, towards the end of that time, then sends them out on missionary tours out by themselves, and they come back and report on that. But then that gets us into his last year, the third year, which is ever increasing opposition. And that's where now the Jews and the Jewish leaders, rather, begin to oppose him. And so it's in this context that we're in now. So let's look at now verses 17 and following. So Jesus goes to the area where Lazarus is, and he's met before he even gets to the house. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. She's filled with grief, but even so, she demonstrates or professes her faith and her trust that Jesus can do something. And then Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "Yeah, I know he will rise again on the last day." But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives in me, or whoever, I'm sorry, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him, "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who has come into the world." So I want to say that again, and this is a phrase that I often use as part of the liturgy in a funeral. Um, Jesus says, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die." So that's the second thing we're pointing out here, is that Jesus claimed power over death. He says, "I am the resurrection. Whoever believes in me, even though that person dies, will live." So I love how David Guzik commented on this passage. He said, Jesus does not claim to have resurrection and life or understand secrets about resurrection and life. Instead, Jesus dramatically said that he is resurrection and life. To know Jesus is to know resurrection and life. To have Jesus is to have resurrection and life. This was a point I made, maybe it was last week or the week before, about how in our culture today there's a lot of people who are fans of Jesus, but they view Jesus more or less as a really great teacher. And yet Jesus, the Gospel of John in particular, reveals that Jesus, when he was here, claimed to be much more than that, much more than just a good teacher. He claimed that he had the power over life and death. He claimed to be the resurrection and the life. And again, each of us, all human beings who hear about this, we need to decide, do we agree with that or not? And Martha, in this case, made her decision. She said, "Yes, I believe you are the Messiah. You are the one sent from God." Okay, well now let's keep going because the passage moves on. Verse 28, after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and he's asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but he was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." I mean, this is the second time Jesus has heard this. I mean, and can you sense the anguish? And it's almost a little bit of an accusation too, right? If you had just been here earlier, you could have prevented this from happening. Because remember, they had seen him heal people, and they believed that he had the power to heal people. And so they hoped that when Lazarus, when their brother was sick, if they could get Jesus there, then Jesus could heal him. But he didn't come. Didn't happen. If you'd only been here, he would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. And Jesus wept. When the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he have, who opened the eyes of the blind, have kept this man from dying?" So again, just stop there. And this is the reminder, not so much just about Jesus, but just of how how people respond and how people experience life and how people experience the Christian life, and that is that we consistently misunderstand God's ways. So Mary and Martha had seen Jesus heal, and they had an understanding of what the possibilities were. And so in their minds, the possibility was that if they could get Jesus to come into this experience and to come into and connect with Lazarus while he was still living, then Jesus could heal him. And now it was too late. And the other Jews thought the same thing. This is such a bummer that Jesus didn't make it back because he could have healed him. And now we're in this if only, right? If only this had happened. If only that had happened. And you know, that's how a lot of us live our lives, with this sense that we have an issue in our lives. Maybe it's a problem, or maybe it's some opportunity and something that we're hoping we could go for, we could experience. Again, if it's a problem, we're hoping and we're praying that God could sort of fix it, and it doesn't work out. It doesn't happen the way that we wanted it to, and we're like, man, if only God had done this. If only that had happened. And we live with such disappointment and frustration because God doesn't respond the way we expect, the way that we want. And Jesus deliberately came into this situation when he did because he wanted to do something better. I don't know what the individual circumstances of your life are and what the if only frustration you have is, but I believe this is a general principle that we have a hope and expectation that God is going to do X, Y, or Z for us, and then it's going to be awesome. And that doesn't happen, and we feel so disappointed and frustrated and maybe even disillusioned because, like, if only that had happened, but God has something different in mind and something in the ultimate scheme of things even better. Now, that doesn't mean that whatever happened wasn't terrible and maybe even wasn't an evil thing. But we know as Christians that God is in the business of taking all that stuff and turning it around and reversing it and using it for good. And we know this passage, right? Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. And there's a lot of qualifiers there, right? It's not saying that all things are good. It's saying that in all these things, even the bad things, even the tragic things, even the evil things, God can take those things and bring good out of them, use them for good purposes. That is, for those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. For those who are seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, what we find is that all these things that are around us, they take a different, there's a different tone to them. There's a different experience. There's a different sense of what all these things mean because we see life in a different perspective. Now, one other thing I want to point out here is the favorite verse of little kids who have to memorize a Bible verse, and they decide to memorize this Bible verse, which is Jesus wept, right? That's the verse that we could all memorize and know by heart. But it's a powerful reminder that even though Jesus knew what was happening, he knew what was coming next, he knew what he was going to do, he knew he had the power to resurrect him, or resurrect Lazarus, but even so, Jesus was moved by the emotions, moved by the sadness, and he wept. Charles Spurgeon, English preacher from a couple of centuries ago, said this about this text. He said, sometimes we're told that if we really believed that our friends would rise again and that they are safe and happy even now, that we should not weep. Why not? Jesus did. There cannot be any error in following where Jesus leads the way. And as the scripture said, there's a time to laugh, but there's also a time to mourn. In fact, it puts it the other way around. There's a time to mourn and a time to laugh. There's a time to weep and a time to dance. That we do experience death as a tragic loss and a separation, and it is the enemy, and we grieve. We do experience tragedy and suffering, and we grieve. But, as Paul says, we do not grieve like those who have no hope. Our grieving is different because we have a different perspective. So let's finish now the story, and this is where we kind of get to the heart of it, and this is what probably we all remember from our Sunday school. Jesus, once more deeply moved, this is now verse 38, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he has been there for 4 days." I'm going to stop there just for a second and give you an aside. This is not going to be up on the screen, but I don't know if you notice, it says there 4 days, and earlier it had also said 4 days. You know what the significance of the days is? I just found it out this week. Okay, so apparently, in the Jewish mindset of that day, there was an idea that if you thought a person was dead, that if someone died, that the spirit of that person would hover around the body for 3 days in the possibility that it would come back, that it would just had fainted or something, right? Kind of that old thing about having a bell inside a coffin in case you bury someone who's you thought was dead but isn't dead, right? So that was the sense that they had, that you have 3 days, and after 3 days, then we know that this body is not going to come back. This person's really dead. Okay, so that's the importance of this, that Jesus stayed that long so that everyone was sure he's really dead. And in fact, we're so sure he's dead, we're concerned there's going to be the smell of decay. All right. Verse 40. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." So this story reveals to us not just that Jesus claimed to have divine power over death, but that he actually had divine power over death. And so he demonstrated his power and raised Lazarus from the dead. Now, this is I suppose this is where we get to the realities and struggles of the life that we live. Part of what I was doing in preparation for the message today was looking at different quotes and things that people write about and talk about the fear of death and the sense of death. And it's really interesting if you were to do a Google search for quotes about the fear of death, or what people's writings about the fear of death, what you'll find is a lot of things written about, we're not really afraid of dying, we're afraid of this or that. And I don't know if you've seen the jokes about this, but apparently there was a research done about giving a poll to people and asking them, "What's your greatest fear?" and fear of death was number 2. Remember, what's the number 1 fear? Public speaking. Jerry Seinfeld said something like, if there's a funeral, you're probably more happy to be in the casket than to be the one giving the eulogy, because we're so afraid of supposedly afraid of speaking. But I actually don't see it that way. I believe, and other people have written about the fact that almost all of our fears and the angst that we have about life comes down to this fear of death. That, you know, think about this. We sit there and we look in the mirror and we see, oh, there's a wrinkle here. Or we wake up in the morning and we got a little hitch in our hip and we're like, oh man, I'm getting older. And we see other people aging. And we're just aware of this passing of time, and we feel unsettled about that. And in fact, one of a huge growing community, it's the image is not very clear there, but this is a logo of a company that is they are biohackers that are working on different different hacks to do in terms of your exercise and your food and supplements and maybe different kinds of surgeries that you could have to extend your life, right? So there's a huge life extension community, and again, it just goes back to this fear, this recognition, this discomfort that we have with being finite, that this life that I'm living is going to end, and it's so unsettling for people. Jennifer Michael Hecht is a professor in New York. She's a philosophy professor, and she talks about this the life extension community, and she said it's kind of crazy if you think about it. It's sort of like you spend your whole life just like trying to make your life last longer. It's like going to a party and you're supposed to be home by midnight, and you spend the whole time, instead of enjoying yourself at the party, you spend your whole time trying to figure out how you can stay longer. And there's this reality, this awareness that we have that this life is going to end. But here's where our Christian faith comes in. Here's where this awareness, this reality that we believe. I guess we just have to say we put this in the realm of our belief. It's part of our faith that God created us, and that there's a part of you that is never going to die. That this body might fall away, but there is that of Mark that is eternal. There, whatever your name is, there's something, there's the you that is housed in your body right now is eternal. And Jesus demonstrates that, and in fact, he demonstrates not only that, but like raises even the body again of Lazarus. And there was also a girl who had just died, who was sick. He raised her, and then came back from the dead himself. So I think probably all of us in this room, our lives have been touched by loss. And for me, this thinking back to the beginning of COVID takes me back to, that's when my dad in a nursing home started failing, and so that it was like the end of May is when he died, and so we went, our family, and we did the whole funeral where we all had to be outside standing up, and can only be 10 of us outside, and we actually had 15 of us. We were rebels. And I just remember that, I don't know, I'll just call it that comfort that was in my soul to know that, as Jesus says here, whoever I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies. And whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?